and I'm very pleased to have our old friend of the show, Professor Stephen Cohen, on the line with us. He's a contributing editor to The Nation, Professor Emeritus of Russian Studies and Politics at New York University and Princeton, the author of Soviet Fates and Lost Alternatives. You can read his work at thenation.com, and you can tweet at The Nation. Professor Cohen, welcome back.
Thank you, Tom.
Thank you so much for being with us. There's so many things that have been happening since the last time we talked about, in the sphere of U.S.-Russian relations, from what's going on in Syria to what's going on with the Donald Trump campaign to what's going on with the Clinton campaign going after Donald Trump about this, and it just where do you want to start?
Well, let me give you, because we haven't talked for a while, my overview or understanding of where we're at with Russia at the moment, and I'll do that quickly, and then you decide where we go. We are, as I've said many times, in a new and more dangerous Cold War with Russia, more dangerous than the 40-year Cold War that we survived. The new Cold War has three fronts, confrontations with Russia, each of which could turn quite easily, imaginably, into a hot war. One is in Ukraine, where the new Cold War really got institutionalized. Secondly is in the Baltic Sea area, the small Baltic countries of Lithuania, Estonia, and Latvia, and also Poland, where NATO is still undertaking a major military buildup on Russia's western borders, the first such military buildup on Russia's western borders since the German invasion of June 1941. And the third new Cold War front, which is also becoming a proxy war, is in Syria, of course. So that's the overview. Now, about 5 or 6 weeks ago, for whatever reasons, President Obama decided to undertake with President Putin of Russia actually what would have been a military alliance, an agreement that the United States and Russia would create a joint command and jointly plan attacks on the terrorists in Syria, the Islamic State and al-Nusra. That would have been, if I can revert to an old-timer's language, a major break in the Cold War that we used to call détente, cooperation. And had that been successful, possibly, that détente or cooperation might have spread to Ukraine and to the Baltic and Black Sea regions. But it was killed very quickly, 48 hours before it was supposed to begin. And there is a debate, who killed it? Now, the American media and Washington say the Russians killed it. But there is plenty of evidence, because our Department of Defense was publicly opposed to this agreement, that in fact it was killed by powerful American groups in Washington, which began 2 days before this agreement was to be implemented, when American warplanes attacked Syrian forces, which was a clear violation of the ceasefire. So now we have, on both sides, Moscow and Washington, intensified, no longer Cold War, but hot war talk. Both sides are threatening each other in Syria. There's talk of escalated American war in Syria against now the Russians and the Syrian forces. There seems to be an assumption that Russia will back down, but that's a fairy tale. It will not. So that's very dangerous. So then we come now to what would normally happen, or happen during the preceding Cold War. We would be having a major debate about this in the United States, and doubly so because we're approaching a presidential election. The candidates would be required to say where they stand on this and what they think. The media would run conflicting op-ed pieces with people advocating different approaches. But instead, we get bumper stickers, Putin's a bully and I'll get him, or a kind of McCarthyite baiting of anybody who would prefer a détente approach, saying that they're agents of the Kremlin and Putin apologists. So the issue, underlying issue, and I'll stop with this, that we ought to be discussing is Russia now, under Putin, a pariah rogue state, as the New York Times and the Washington Post and its columnists are telling us? Or, as other of us think, is Russia America's most essential partner in the world today, that our interests do not collide, that this vilification of Putin has become making national security policy by vilification and attitude, rather than a calculation of American interests? But we don't have this debate. So the situation is dire geopolitically and very dire in terms of our own democracy.
And meanwhile, Donald Trump is saying we should
choose your poison.
Right. We should have Russia as an ally, which makes, to me, perfect sense. And I'm not sure exactly what Hillary Clinton is saying about all of this, or for that matter, how it's being politicized. But it seems like it's like Russia's the big, the bugaboo. It's the bugbear, or whatever the old phrase was.
Well, Clinton has been consistent, and consistency, I guess, is good because we know what she represents. For a very long time, and certainly since the presidential campaign began, she has represented a very, very hard line toward Russia. She's boasted about how tough she was with Putin. It isn't true, but lots of untrue things are said in presidential elections. She's equated Putin with Hitler, which is preposterous, but she thinks it's a good talking point. And she's called for a no-fly zone, that the United States would impose a ban on any Russian or Syrian aircraft flying in Syria. As General Dumford, I believe his name is, he's currently the chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff, had testified to Congress, I think it was only last week, a no-fly zone imposed by the United States, and I think I quote him exactly, would mean war with Russia. So the logic of Mrs. Clinton's position, if she actually would take that position as president, would mean certainly at least the risk of war with Russia, attacking its forces in Syria in the air, on the ground. Trump, and God has kind of, in his infinite mischief, given us the most imperfect of messengers. But Trump, for whatever reasons, from the beginning of his presidential campaign, has said things like, I think I quote him, "I don't see why we can't cooperate with Russia. And wouldn't it be great if Russia destroyed the Islamic State in Syria for us or with us?" And he said things about Putin that are not entirely wrong, that Putin is a very strong leader at home. Trump thinks Putin's a stronger leader in Russia than Obama is in America, but the equation or comparison makes no sense because they're different political systems. But he's right. He's saying Putin is a strong leader and somebody who should be our partner. And for this, Trump was called, and even in the New York Times, a client of the Kremlin, a Manchurian candidate. And Mrs. Clinton has a website called Trump Putin. So she has decided that it's good to run against Putin as she runs against Trump. And that's old-fashioned kind of Kremlin red baiting. And it's not good, but the Clinton campaign is using this. I don't know why they would do this. They must know it's not healthy for our democracy. But the urgent need, and I mean urgent as in today and tomorrow, and so I'm glad that you are willing to have this conversation, is does Russia really pose a threat to us, to our vital interests? If not, or if only marginally, then why wouldn't we, since we have many clear common interests, but most immediately international terrorism, and specifically the terrorist forces in Syria, why wouldn't we form the kind of alliance that it appears President Obama proposed, but then he vanished, as he often does on international affairs, and has hardly said a public word about it as it was assassinated. So the two campaigns, and by the way, in the debate the other night, as everybody noticed, Pence kind of ran away from Trump's position on Putin in Russia by saying that he, like Senator Kaine, was just as anti-Putin as anybody, and Pence called Putin a little bully, which is not the kind of language we need at the moment. We need a discussion of, as we had, oddly enough, when communists ran Russia, a discussion of our mutual and conflicting interests to see if there's something vital there on which we can base the kind of a détente or cooperation that Obama seemed to want briefly 2 or 3 weeks ago.
Yeah, it's a conundrum. I mean, the last thing on earth I would do is vote for Donald Trump on any one issue. And it is extremely troubling to me when he's, in my opinion, right on even one issue, which makes me crazy. Stephen Cohen, we'll continue this conversation in just a moment. We're talking with Professor Stephen Cohen, contributing editor to The Nation, Professor Emeritus of Russian Studies and Politics at NYU and Princeton, author of Soviet Faiths and Lost Alternatives.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
And, of course, writing for TheNation.com. We'll be back with Professor Cohen in just a moment. And welcome back. Professor Cohen, how do you respond to people who say, but, you know, President Putin is a tough guy, that, you know, that's not small d democracy, that journalists get killed in Russia, maybe the state has something to do with it, that they have a horrible record of treatment of gay people in that country. You know, these are this is kind of the stack of rationales for why Russia should not be our ally that gets typically thrown out there.
It's a good question, but it's an enormous and dense question. The vilification, or what I call the demonization of Putin, began nearly a decade ago. I'm actually trying to write a very long article about it, looking at the charges that have been leveled against him. I'd say 90 to 95% of them have no evidential basis. They're just allegations, like he kills journalists, or he killed that former KGB agent by radiation poisoning in London, or that he ordered the shoot down of the Malaysian aircraft, a passenger plane over Ukraine in 2014. These are allegations roughly in the category of birther claims about Obama and the persistent theme that you can find on the internet that Lyndon Johnson killed President Kennedy. They are simply conspiracy theories, and there's no basis. And a great nation, or any nation, can't make its national security policy based on allegations for which there is no evidence. How you get through that, I don't know. But in my way of thinking, the responsibility falls very heavily on the people who control the mainstream American media. They have not permitted or been intelligent enough to bring these questions to the forefront in the presidential debates thus far. And that includes the primary debates. But whenever they inadvertently trip over the national security issue as it relates to Russia, the moderator, as Lester Holt did, and I'm sure will happen on Sunday night, though we might get lucky, doesn't press the issue. Doesn't say to the candidates, well, look, we're at risk of war with Russia in Syria. Here's what's happened. What would be your position? Part of the problem is they're afraid of the subject. I mean, really, the climate in this country, in the mainstream media, has become McCarthy-like. Nobody wants to be accused, as I have been, and people more eminent than myself, even Henry Kissinger, of being an apologist for the Kremlin. I think of myself as an apologist for American national security. The other problem is these people believe their own newspapers. And you don't find in the newspapers, the main newspapers, which for political purposes are the New York Times and the Washington Post, you don't find a full narrative of how we got where we are today with Russia and what's going on. I mean, the hardest example, because it's tragic and it's probably on your mind, is the current Russian-Syrian assault on Aleppo in Syria. Right. But how we got to that, what could be, though it's being overstated in the media. Every day there's a insistence that Putin is now creating war crimes in Aleppo. But how we got to that is never discussed.
Yeah. We're talking with Stephen Cohen, Professor Stephen Cohen, contributing editor to The Nation, Professor Emeritus of Russian Studies and Politics at NYU, and author of Soviet Fates and Lost Alternatives, among others. We'll be back in just a moment. Welcome back. Still with us, Professor Stephen Cohen, contributing editor to The Nation, Professor Emeritus of Russian Studies and Politics at NYU and Princeton, author of Soviet Fates and Lost Alternatives. You can read his writings at thenation.com and tweet him at The Nation. Professor Cohen, where were we?
We were talking about your paper route when you were a kid. I think I actually might be able to match that. I grew up in Kentucky. I had a paper route, but I delivered the papers on one of our horses.
Really? Seriously?
Yeah, no, seriously. I only had the neighborhood, but you get on the horse with the papers and go dump them on people's front yards.
How cool is that?
And the horse would leave his remains there, too. So Steve had been by.
Somewhat analogous to some of our newspapers today.
Well, the question is, does your local newspaper still exist? Mine in Owensboro, Kentucky actually does still exist.
Oh, that's marvelous. So how do we, I mean,
where we are.
We had, Hillary Clinton and Vladimir Putin, or I guess it would be Lavrov, his Secretary of State, or his equivalent, his foreign minister. They worked out the Iran deal together. They worked out a deal to destroy Syria's chemical weapons together. They worked out a deal to reduce nuclear stockpiles together. Did they not?
They did.
So where did it blow up?
It's a good question. Let me begin with the end of the story. Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, is widely considered in the professional diplomatic corps as one of the great foreign ministers, or secretary of states, as we would call them, of the 21st century. He is really an amazing advocate for Russia, but he's also a man who can do deals, understands deals. Now, he, like Kerry, act only with the consent of their bosses, Obama and Putin.
Right.
And you're absolutely right. They did two things that are very important, but have been discredited or forgotten, which provide the question you ask: if they did that, why can't they do this? When Obama was faced with political pressure to attack Damascus over Assad's alleged use of chemical weapons, it's only alleged, and Obama did not want to, and the British Parliament would not go along, and his own Democratic Party in Congress would not go along, Putin, using Lavrov, brokered a deal for Assad to give up his chemical weapons. Now, to this day, that's been interpreted in a revisionist way, that it was a sign of weakness on Obama's part. He should have attacked Damascus. But what would have happened in the Middle East if he'd attacked Damascus? It might have been also an attack, interpreted as such, on Tehran. We might now be at war there with Iran. And certainly we would no longer have any Russian help in anything. And then later, as you say, it was Lavrov and Kerry and Putin and Obama who brokered the treaty. It's a treaty, and 6 or 7 nations are party to it. So Trump can't abrogate it, even if he wanted to. The agreement that Iran would not reach the level of producing nuclear material capable of resulting in nuclear weapons. I think that's a very good agreement. And I don't think for a minute that Trump either understands it or would actually try to nullify it, which he can't do alone anyway. But the precedent, you're right, the precedent is there. And the reason it's important is those were 2 instances when American and Russian interests completely became compatible. And so leaders who were adults decided they needed to cooperate, and they instructed their foreign ministers, Secretary of State Kerry and Lavrov, to do that. Now, what's important for you to know, because it's never reported in the American press, that Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, is under fierce attack in Moscow by the Russian hawks who think he's sold out Russia, who think he's too soft, who think his fondness for Western cigarettes, beaches, and alcohol mean he's too Westernized. But the attacks on Lavrov are attacks on Putin.
Professor Cohen, can you stick around for another 15-minute segment after the news break at the bottom of the hour?
Happily. Thank
you very much. Professor Stephen Cohen with us. I would like to, I want to learn more. We'll be right back. It's 28 minutes past the hour.
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-808-9925.
Back with Professor Stephen Cohen, contributing editor to The Nation, right after this. Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you, and Professor Stephen Cohen on the line with us, contributing editor to The Nation, Professor Emeritus of Russian Studies and Politics at NYU and Princeton, the author of Soviet Fates and Lost Alternatives. You have another book that was recently reprinted in paperback, if I'm remembering correctly, Professor?
I have a forthcoming book that I have missed the deadline on called Why Cold War Again? It was supposed to be out about now. Now it's going to be early 2017 because I didn't get my act together.
Can people pre-order it?
Probably, but let's wait till we get it in my hand.
All right.
But, you know, how much time do we have?
We're going to have 8 minutes because I've got a newscast, that we do every day at 1:45. So I've got to hit out of that.
I got you. Can I do a quick riff on something you said and then take us to a crucial issue?
Yes. Excuse me. We'll have 10 minutes. It's all yours.
Well, no, between us. But I was listening to your reading about the founding fathers and the tradition, the anti-corporate, anti-aristocratic tradition in American, the origins of the American state. And, the founding fathers, and George Kennan, the late George Kennan, who was thought to be very wise about American-Russian relations, also pointed out that the founding fathers, as George quoted Adams as saying, did not believe in going abroad to find demons to slay.
Yeah, it was the end of George Washington's farewell address.
And Washington returned to it as well. So there is this tradition in America that the United States should defend only its own vital interests, and it was not put on earth to defend all the imagined interests of countries abroad, unless they directly related to those of the United States. That tradition was alive in America until, I think, maybe roughly the Clinton administration, when the so-called neocon liberal interventionist orthodoxy came to dominate our media and our policy making, and we've embarked on all these wars. So, for example, everybody knows this, we demonized Saddam, we went to war, we got what we got. We demonized Gaddafi, we went to war in Libya, and now it's going to be the second capital of the Islamic State. And Senator Sanders took up the domestic tradition that you referred to, but nobody has come forward in the last 25 years, since the end of the Soviet Union, to take up the other tradition of restrained use of American power abroad. And instead, that tradition has been called isolationist. It's not isolationist. It's thoughtful, rational, and selective. And we've lost that. And that brings us to today, and a debate we also don't have. The fundamental strategic disagreement regarding Syria between Washington and Moscow is that Washington has said for 5, 6, 7, 8 years, the president of Syria, Assad, must go, that he's the source of all the problems. The Russians say, naoborot, just the opposite. The main goal in Syria is destroying terrorism. And you can't do that without Assad and the Syrian army. And if Assad is removed, the Islamic army will occupy Damascus. I believe that to be a true analysis. And Washington has never told us who they imagine to govern Damascus if Washington is able to remove Assad. They refer to some moderate, free-fighting oppositionists in Syria. But nobody's been able to produce these people. One general from the Pentagon said he thought he could count 5 of them, individuals. And moreover, the evidence comes in that they're receiving American weapons and they're collaborating with the terrorists. So we, in fact, indirectly are funding the terrorists. This drives the Russians up the wall. And that's what's really divided the two countries in Syria. And that's what caused the agreement, the détente, to collapse last week. So the question is, why does everybody in the United States of influence say Assad must go and the Russians are there to bolster Assad? They are there. That was the purpose of the Russian intervention 1 year ago in September 2015, because Damascus was going to fall. The Islamic State was in the suburbs of Damascus. Russia went in to bolster Assad and his army, and they fought their way all the way. They retook Palmyra, a historic city. They saved Palmyra. They're now fighting in Aleppo. They wanted to fight in Aleppo with the United States, but we withdrew. One point that's overlooked: yes, it's horrible. There are women and children in Aleppo, but in eastern Aleppo, there are perhaps tens or thousands of the best jihadist fighters. Putin, Russia, has resolved to destroy those fighters. He wanted to do it with Obama. Obama withdrew. So we are now faulting Russia for continuing the war in eastern Aleppo with Russia's determination, which it's to kill those, destroy that jihadist army, which Russia regards as a threat to its own interest, not only in the Middle East, but in Russia itself. Many of those fighters are carrying Russian passports. That's what we need to discuss. Is it possible that Russia is right, that to remove Assad would turn Damascus over to the Islamic army? And among the states that do not want this is Israel, which tacitly has supported the Russian military campaign in Syria. But you would not get a glimmer of that news or a piece of that discussion in the United States. And that's a failure. That's our failure. I mean, whatever side you're on, it should be debated so that there's a alternative policy discussed toward Russia, and not only in Syria, because the Ukrainian crisis can also be resolved. Negotiations are on the table, but our government in Kiev, the Poroshenko government, will not implement these agreements, even though they are supported, the agreements, by the French and the Germans. So we've got a lot of problems on our end. We have created this problem in many ways.
Well, isn't the Syrian conflict also further complicated by two things? One, that Russia has a major naval base in Syria. So, you know, I can just imagine how we would react if Russia said that they were declaring a no-fly zone over Qatar, where our Fifth Fleet is anchored, if my recollection is correct. And then secondly, that a lot of the groups that we have both supported and fought against are so fluid. These groups that are not identifying themselves as ISIL and not identifying themselves as al-Nusra Front, but there's dozens of these groups with different names that on any given day of the week, they may well affiliate themselves with ISIL if they think that's who's winning, or they may affiliate themselves with Assad, or they may affiliate themselves with us. I mean, this is not like Democrats versus Republicans with clear ideological differences and all that sort of thing. Or am I completely off base on either of those points?
No, I think you're on all bases, I would say, because we can throw in the Turks, who are running their own operation in Syria. And I mean, after all, Turkey is a NATO country, but it doesn't look like a NATO country. I mean, it had an attempted coup. Now there's a massive repression underway in Turkey, not compatible with NATO or European values. You're right. I mean, it's a complete smorgasbord of competing groups. But fundamentally, it's become a proxy war between Washington and Moscow. And therefore, fundamentally, Washington and Moscow can at least make the situation much better, in a sense that not so many people will die. And that's why what happened last week and the week before, the collapse of this first effort of a major cooperation with Russia, is so important. It could have ramified in a good direction. Now it's ramifying in a bad direction. And the puzzle for me is, where is President Obama? This was his program, his policy, worked out with Putin. And when push came to shove, and let me add something that's been overlooked. Not only did the Department of Defense, Ashton Carter and his spokesman, publicly express opposition to this agreement with Russia, but feature this, Tom, one of his spokesmen said that the Department of Defense, might not implement the alliance with Russia, even if President Obama ordered it. That's a clear challenge to the constitutional authority of the President of the United States.
Arguably, as was the U.S. bombing 2 days before that agreement took place, right?
Correct. And so the question becomes, and Russia asked this publicly a few days later, who is making American foreign policy? the President of the United States or the Secretary of the Department of Defense.
Right.
And to my astonishment, the New York Times, in an editorial, did note this. Noted that the Department of Defense said it might not implement a lawful constitutional order by the president. And the New York Times said it understood because the risk might be too great. The issue was sharing intelligence with Russia. And this kind of existential threat to our Constitution simply was let to pass. That would have been a great question to ask one of the presidential candidates.
Yeah.
If you issued this order and the Secretary of Defense said he might not implement it, would you remove the Secretary of Defense?
Yeah, and that literally is a constitutional crisis. This is amazing. Professor Stephen Cohen, contributing editor to The Nation, Professor Emeritus of Russian Studies and Politics at NYU and Princeton, author of Soviet Fates and Lost Alternatives. Stephen, it is always an honor and a pleasure to have you with us. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Thom.
Thank you so much for dropping by. We'll be back. It's 15 minutes before the end.